Hello, my name is John Holden. I'm a board member of the Edgewater Historical Society and Museum and also the curator of our latest exhibit, High Water in Hell. Chicago's rising lakefront creates a crisis for the city. This exhibit came about through my basic observations over the last couple of years that the lake level in Lake Michigan was getting extraordinarily high. For people in the city, that's no big secret. But a year ago, I was working on the mayoral campaign of Paul Vallis, who obviously did not win the mayor's race, but said that I thought that there was a good chance that the next mayor would be dealing with a major crisis if the lake did not reverse direction. And here in February of 2020, we are at that point. My interest in the lake level goes back over 30 years. I was a reporter in the 1980s, and one of the stories that I covered was the flooding of the lakeshore caused by Lake Michigan's previous high level. That was a very dramatic turn of events for the city, and it was an issue that had ongoing interest for me. Over the years, there were a lot of follow-up actions that were taken to try to figure out how can the city avoid a future crisis with the lake level should it go back up to its historic highs. We are still grappling with those very issues, and this exhibit explores where we were back in the 1980s, what happened in the years in between, and where we are now. With the beginning of the exhibit here, we just take a very brief look back at what actually happened in the 1980s. The weather conditions in Chicago through the 1980s were such that Lake Michigan went to a very high level, the highest level in recorded history, and really caught the city by surprise, especially those people who lived along the lakefront. The majority of the buildings along the lakeshore in the Edgewater neighborhood were built in the 1960s and 70s. They replaced what were mainly single-family mansions, and as a result of this construction, there were now thousands and thousands of people living right on the water's front. So the flooding and other calamitous activity from the 1980s was obviously affecting a lot of people in a very major way. The lake level in the 1980s became especially significant during the winter of 1986 and spring of 1987. That also coordinated with the re-election campaign for Mayor Harold Washington, and the month of the primary election in February of 1987 was probably the most severe day in the or period in the entire winter that year. Major storms caused massive flooding on the lakefront, and we see some of the massive waves that were produced by those storms, as well as the aftermath. Some of these very dramatic photos that showed not only the water coming on to the lakefront or Lakeshore Drive, but also the ice that resulted because these storms were happening in the midst of a very, very cold period of time as well. So I think some of these photos provide very dramatic proof of how damaging this storm actually was. The storms really produced a lot of soul searching among elected officials and others that were concerned about the fate of Chicago's lakefront. There were a number of parties that were involved: the city's Department of Transportation, the Chicago Park District, which is the main owner of lakefront land in the city of Chicago, but also other necessary parties such as the Army Corps of Engineers, which has a very major role to play in what gets done on the waterfront in Chicago. The storm subsided, and there were, as a result, a number of commissions that were formed to examine what. As I'd mentioned earlier, there are currently a number of high-rise buildings along the waterfront in Edgewater, and most of these buildings were constructed in the 1960s and 1970s. There was an absolutely fascinating news article that one of my colleagues here at the Edgewater Historical Society found, Marcia Holland, doing some research on the history of real estate development in Edgewater. She came across this Chicago Tribune story that really well documented the dramatic changes that took place in Edgewater in the 1960s. As we can see here, between the periods of roughly the late 1950s and the early 1970s, over a dozen major high-rise buildings were constructed in the Sheridan Road corridor. These buildings were usually built on the land that had been previously occupied by single-family houses, and most of those houses were lost in the period of this development. It's significant in regards to the lake level in that we now have thousands of people whose homes and those home values are literally being threatened with the rising lake level. This next section of the exhibit provides an overview of many of the panel's work that were appointed to try to figure out how to keep the city safe from a rising lake level. The most important of these commissions was the Chicago Shoreline Protection Commission, which was chaired by former Chicago Alderman Martin Oberman. That report basically came up with a series of recommendations saying that the city needed to do more to buffer the lakefront from a rising lake. Essentially, the biggest takeaway from that was that the city needed to have additional land along the lakefront to prevent the waves from inundating both the residential buildings right on the waterfront as well as other public assets like Lakeshore Drive and the city's parks. The commission itself produced a series of follow-up reports. There were a number of other activities that were taking place by individual entities that were impacted by the lakefront, including Loyola University, which was looking to do a major expansion with landfill into Lake Michigan to expand their campus, and other individual communities such as Edgewater, which were looking for ways to localize solutions for the problem of the rising lake. These reports, some of which are excerpted in the exhibit, produced a series of very interesting proposals that were developed through community charrettes and other means. Basically, what a landfill proposal for the lakefront might mean, what kinds of amenities might be created in conjunction with adding additional parkland along the lakefront, and so forth. Many people don't know, but Chicago's lakefront is actually almost 100% man-made. The city of Chicago, in its natural state before it was settled, basically was a long string of sandy beaches and marshes. Right now we have basically hard edges along most of the waterfront that were created through a series of revetments that were built. Those systems began to fail catastrophically in 1987 and the years that followed as a result of the rising lake. Some of the proposals up in the Edgewater area involved different scenarios. Some were to build simple barrier islands out in the lake. Others involved creating some additional land right adjacent to the current lakefront. Some of them proposed creating additional lagoons and things of that nature. There was also some talk of possibly extending Lakeshore Drive from its current terminus at Hollywood all the way up to the Chicago border with Evanston. These proposals really are kind of interesting to go back and look at in the current setting and to see how much was envisioned and then to reflect on how little was actually ever achieved. The people who were most immediately impacted by the flooding issues in the 80s were those who lived in the high-rise buildings along Sheridan Road, on the east side of Sheridan Road specifically. They had a great deal of water inundation into the basements and parking garages of the buildings there, and they were those that were most immediately concerned about finding a solution. The ultimate solution that many of those buildings found was achieved through federal funding that was provided at the behest of then Congressman Sidney Yates, and it basically had the Army Corps of Engineers create what might be called a stopgap measure. That is illustrated in the pictures that we have at the top of the exhibit here. Basically, what's known as riprap was dumped into the lake in areas right along the shoreline where the high-rises stand on Sheridan Road. This is basically large chunks of limestone and concrete that created some additional stability for the foundations of these buildings, which literally abut directly on the lakefront. So that did provide a measure of stability for these properties for the last 30 years or so. Perhaps more importantly, though, was the fact that once the lake hit its high level in 1987, it dramatically dropped off. The summer of 1988 especially was the hottest on record for the city of Chicago. We went through a prolonged drought for that entire summer, and the lakefront literally dropped several feet in the space of just 1 or 2 years. So the sense of urgency for addressing the lakefront perhaps started to slip away a little more than it should have, because as we all know, the lake is a cyclical thing, and we're now back at a crisis stage, and we haven't really made a whole lot of progress in solving the long-term difficulties that are posed by a high lake level. The series here also shows that in addition to the riprap that was placed along the foundations of the high-rise buildings, a barrier island of sorts was also constructed from riprap just east of Thorndale Beach, and that's perhaps the most significant and lasting result of the emergency efforts that were undertaken in the wake of the 1986-87 flooding. That island is still very prominent. It's just east of Thorndale Beach, as I mentioned, and it also serves as a bit of a yardstick for what's going on with the lake. The series that we have here shows that over the years, the barrier island became not an island, but rather part of the beach itself. As the lake level dropped and as sand accumulated around the island, it actually became connected to the main land, and quite prominently back in the late 2000s and early teens. The island is very much a part of the beach at Thorndale, which kind of got quite large back around the years of 2010 to 2013. But once we got into the middle of this past decade, the lake level was going up, and once again, the island became an island. As we can see in the more recent photos, Thorndale Beach is now a fraction of what it had been just 5 years ago. This last photo we have is actually from October of 2018, and if we were to get another shot right now, we would see that it's even more dramatically reduced. The final section of the exhibit is called A Lasting Solution, and that title ends with a question mark for a very good reason. We really don't know what the solution will be at this point. In the fall of 2019, when the lake first started kicking up and causing, again, severe damage on the lakefront, there was an emergency meeting convened by Aldermen Harry Osterman of the 48th Ward and Maria Haddon of the 49th Ward. Also at that meeting were representatives from the Chicago Department of Transportation and the Army Corps of Engineers. The basic conclusion was that the most lasting solution for the lakefront would involve landfill and construction projects that undoubtedly would cost billions of dollars that no one in our cash-strapped government seemed to know where it would come from. The lake level, again, is at its highest level, and in January of 2020, it actually exceeded the previous high that was achieved back in the 1980s. Where that will go from here is anyone's guess. A lot will depend on what the future weather patterns are in the city of Chicago. This year we did not have a major freezing over of the lake, which is one of the most significant contributing elements to a rising lake level. So whether that provides us with any long-term benefit has yet to be determined. Precipitation patterns are also obviously a major driving factor. The science is probably still yet to be determined as to what the long-term future of the Great Lakes will be. Because of climate change, there is a lot of speculation that there will be more frequent and intense rainfall. The basin of the Great Lakes is quite large, and it's possible that we are going to see a lake level that will be significantly higher than we currently have. It's also possible that we will see a lake level that is significantly lower than we've ever seen. No one really has any answers to these questions. As recently as 5 to 10 years ago, there was dramatic concern that the Great Lakes were on a irreversible downward spiral. In fact, a cover story in National Geographic magazine focused on that very calumny that the Great Lakes, in fact, were going to evaporate much more than we had ever seen, and that a lot of the quote-unquote waterfront that we had been used to would be some great distance away from the high-rises and boatyards and industrial shipping facilities that had been constructed over the last 200 years. That problem is obviously not one we're worried about right now. In this case, we have some exhibits that kind of demonstrate the natural ebb and flow of Lake Michigan and the other Great Lakes. Some of the materials, most of which were provided by Professor Tom Murphy, a former EHS board member, show that the Great Lakes are much more than just the lakes themselves. They are the drainage basin for an enormous swath of land that straddles the United States and Canada. The amount of water that comes into the Great Lakes is usually dependent on rainfall in that water basin. And like an enormous plumbing system, the Great Lakes drain from Lake Superior at the north into Huron and Michigan, and then ultimately into Erie and Ontario, and then outward to the Atlantic Ocean. The amount of water that comes in and out of the Great Lakes every year is staggering, and the amount of water that is diverted out of the Great Lakes through human activity is relatively insignificant. The cycles for the lake, again, are utterly unpredictable and completely contingent on what Mother Nature throws at the system. In the back wall of the museum, we have an addendum exhibit of sorts on the lakefront. While the city did not ever construct significant new offshore barriers or new parkland along the lakefront, it did commit itself to rebuilding much of the existing lakefront that had been created over the last 100 to 150 years. Specifically, the old limestone revetment systems that lined much of both Lincoln Park and Grant Park and Burnham Park on the south side. These limestone revetments were very popular with Chicagoans. They created a very sculptural element on the lakefront and were much beloved by many people throughout the city. Some sections of the lakefront had specific cultural significance for different groups of people, but by the 1980s and 1990s, much of that system was in complete failure, and these limestone revetment systems, which are illustrated in some of the documents we have, were literally falling apart and collapsing into the lake. The city of Chicago, working with the Chicago Park District and the Army Corps of Engineers, undertook a very ambitious plan to rebuild the lakefront system by removing the limestone block revetment and replacing it with essentially a new concrete system that provided additional protection for the lakefront. There was a lot of controversy about some of this work. Obviously, a lot of people believe that the old limestone systems were more aesthetically appealing. There were a lot of localized battles to try to stop some of the reconstruction, but ultimately most of the lakefront was rebuilt, and this work is still just finally being completed as we finish the 2010s. One section of the old limestone revetment that was not replaced, to give you an idea of what it looked like, was out on the Promontory Point location just east of Hyde Park. This was an especially popular section of the lakefront with Hyde Parkers and especially the swimmers who have long been using Promontory Point as a major congregation spot. The city was fighting very hard about in like the late 1990s to replace Promontory Point, but there was major community organizing around stopping that, and one person who played a very prominent role in stopping that was then State Senator Barack Obama. The system of limestone on Chicago's lakefront is largely gone now, but Promontory Point is still holding up relatively well and is a classic example of what Chicago's historic lakefront looked like.